Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly unglamorous journey back to the hallowed, yet profoundly grimy, halls of a medieval university. Forget the romanticized images of scholarly pursuits and intellectual freedom. You're about to discover that the life of a student in a medieval university was often awful and boring. A relentless grind of monotonous lectures, harsh discipline, and squalid living conditions that made the pursuit of knowledge a truly grueling ordeal. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive the first week without longing for the simple, if laborious, life of a peasant. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly transported to a bustling, yet rather unkempt, city like Paris, Bologna, or Oxford, sometime in the 13th or 14th century. The air is thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, animal waste, wood smoke, and a persistent underlying scent of damp stone. You're not a seasoned scholar yet. You are a young boy, perhaps just 14 or 15 years old, a baccalaureus bachelor-to-be, having just arrived from your provincial village, and here's the first shock: you're likely far younger than what you might imagine a university student to be. This early start, combined with the harsh realities of medieval education, was the brutal beginning of your academic journey. It truly sucked to be a teenager living like a monk. While today we associate university with young adults, in the Middle Ages, students often began their studies at a surprisingly young age, sometimes even as early as 12 or 13 after completing a basic grammar school education, which itself was often rudimentary and limited to noble or wealthy merchant families. This meant you were a literal child, suddenly thrust into a challenging, often dangerous, urban environment. Far from the protective embrace of your family, your parents, if they were affluent enough to afford the fees and support your studies, often saw this as a crucial investment in your future, a pathway to a career in the church, law, or medicine, elevating your family's social standing. Your first challenge would be to integrate into your new life, which often began by joining a nation. Medieval universities were organized into nations based on students' regions of origin, e.g., the Picard nation, the English nation, the Norman nation in Paris. These nations served as your social and protective groups, offering some camaraderie and mutual support in a foreign city. However, they also fostered fierce rivalries between groups, often leading to drunken brawls in the streets, adding a layer of unpredictable danger to your daily life. It really sucked to join a gang just to get by. Your initial studies would be in the Faculty of Arts, the foundational program before you could specialize in higher faculties like theology, law, or medicine. The curriculum was centered on the liberal arts, divided into the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. While this sounds intellectually stimulating, the reality was often far from it. The teaching methods were dominated by lectures and rote memorization. Imagine sitting on a hard wooden bench in a cold, unheated lecture hall from early morning until late afternoon. Your professor, often a monk or cleric, would read aloud from a single, precious manuscript, often in Latin, which was the universal language of medieval academia. You wouldn't have your own copies of these texts. Books were incredibly rare and expensive, copied painstakingly by hand. Your task was to listen intently, to memorize vast passages, and to perhaps furiously scribble notes onto small wax tablets or parchment scraps, trying to capture every word. There were no engaging PowerPoints, no interactive discussions, no visual aids beyond perhaps a simple diagram drawn in the dirt. It truly sucked to learn by being yelled at in Latin. The process of learning was incredibly passive. Your role was to absorb information, not to question it or engage in critical analysis, at least not at this foundational stage. The emphasis was on authority. The authority of the classical texts, Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and the authority of the Church Fathers. You were expected to internalize the established wisdom, not to challenge it. Imagine spending years simply repeating and memorizing, with little opportunity for independent thought or creative exploration. Debates and disputations, public arguments would be introduced later in your studies, particularly in logic and theology. While these offered a chance to hone your rhetorical skills and defend a position, they were highly formalized affairs, governed by strict rules, and often more about winning an argument through cleverness than discovering new truths. You weren't developing your own theories. You were learning to skillfully manipulate existing knowledge within accepted frameworks. The sheer volume of material to be memorized was immense. Imagine trying to commit entire philosophical treatises, complex theological arguments, and intricate legal codes to memory without the aid of textbooks, internet searches, or even organized libraries as we know them. Your memory was your most crucial tool, and any lapses could be met with harsh discipline. One common misconception is that medieval universities were open to everyone. Access was highly restricted. Students were overwhelmingly male and predominantly from wealthy or noble families, or those sponsored by the church, as the costs of tuition, lodging, and living were prohibitive for the vast majority of the population. While some talented individuals from humbler backgrounds might be sponsored by monasteries or wealthy patrons, this was the exception, not the rule. Historians still meticulously study student registers and financial records to understand the precise social backgrounds and demographic profiles of medieval university students across different European cities, consistently finding them to be an elite group. Furthermore, the language barrier itself was a constant source of stress. Even if you had some prior Latin instruction, living and learning entirely in Latin, a complex and nuanced language, would be an ongoing struggle. Imagine attending lectures, debating, and socializing, all in a foreign tongue. Your days would be filled with mental exertion just to comprehend and express yourself, adding another layer of exhaustion to your already demanding schedule. So, your journey into medieval academia began at a surprisingly young age, thrusting you into a world of immense pressure and relentless discipline. Your education was dominated by monotonous lectures, rote memorization, and a passive approach to knowledge, all conducted in a foreign language. This brutal, uninspiring start to your university life was the first, and perhaps most foundational, reason why being a student in a medieval university was often profoundly awful and boring. Having endured the grueling, uninspiring start to your academic career, you, the young student, now face the daily reality of your medieval education, monotonous lectures, and endless rote learning. Forget vibrant discussions or interactive lessons. Your pursuit of knowledge was a passive, often mind-numbingly boring grind, making your time at university undeniably awful and boring. Imagine your typical day, starting well before dawn. You'd be roused from your hard, uncomfortable bed in a cramped dormitory, perhaps by the ringing of a church bell or the insistent shouting of a college master after a brief, probably cold, washing and a meager, bland breakfast. You would make your way to the lecture hall. These weren't grand, ornate amphitheaters. They were often simple, unheated rooms, sometimes even just a rented space in a private house. You'd squeeze onto a hard wooden bench with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other students, all jostling for a position where they might actually hear the lecturer. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and stale breath. It truly sucked to wake up early just to be bored stiff. Your professor, typically a master of arts or a doctor in a higher faculty, would take his place at a podium or a simple chair before him. He would have a single, precious manuscript, the definitive text for the day's lesson. This manuscript was likely old, perhaps worn, and certainly hand-copied, making it an invaluable treasure. Your professor would then begin to read aloud from this text, slowly and deliberately, often adding his own commentary, explanations, or interpretations. Your role was entirely passive to listen, absorb, and memorize. You wouldn't have your own copies of these books. Printing presses were centuries away, and every book was a unique, expensive artifact. So you couldn't follow along, highlight passages, or easily review the material later. Your memory was your most crucial tool. You would strain to catch every word, every nuance, trying to commit vast passages of Latin text to memory. Some students might furiously scratch notes onto small wax tablets, which could be erased and reused, or onto expensive parchment scraps, trying to capture the essence of the lecture. But the primary method of learning was repetition and memorization. Imagine sitting there, hour after hour, as your professor droned on, reading from a single text. There were no engaging PowerPoints, no interactive whiteboards, no compelling videos or online resources. There were no lively debates at this foundational level, no stimulating questions to spark your interest. Your mind would inevitably wander, battling boredom and fatigue. The words would wash over you, a monotonous drone that was hard to focus on, even when your future depended on it. It really sucked to be a human recorder. The material itself, while foundational to medieval thought, was often presented in an incredibly dry, systematic manner. You might be listening to endless discussions of Latin grammar, the intricacies of logic, syllogisms, fallacies, etc., or the subtle distinctions of rhetoric. While important for intellectual development, the pedagogical approach was designed for authority and transmission of established knowledge, not for inspiring curiosity or critical inquiry. You were expected to internalize the wisdom of the ancients and the church fathers, not to challenge it. This reliance on rote learning meant that your academic success hinged almost entirely on your ability to memorize vast amounts of information and to accurately reproduce it in examinations or disputations. True understanding, synthesis, or creative application of knowledge was secondary to simply knowing the text. This made studying a tedious, repetitive chore, devoid of the intellectual thrill that modern learning can offer. One common misconception is that medieval university students were always keen scholars, eager for knowledge. While intellectual pursuit was certainly a motivator for some, many students were there primarily for vocational training to become lawyers, clerics, or doctors, and saw their studies as a necessary means to an end. The boredom and rigor of the lectures undoubtedly tested even the most dedicated. Historians still meticulously study student notes when available, and university statutes to understand the precise pedagogical methods and expectations of medieval lecturers, often revealing a consistent emphasis on memorization and mastery of authoritative texts. Furthermore, the language barrier added another layer of monotony and difficulty. As mentioned, all lectures were conducted in Latin, the universal language of medieval academia, even if you had some prior Latin instruction from a grammar school. Living and learning entirely in a complex, nuanced foreign language would be an ongoing struggle. Imagine attending lectures, trying to understand subtle arguments, and taking notes, all in a tongue that was not your native language. Your brain would be constantly working overtime just to comprehend. adding to the exhaustion and making the learning process even more tedious. The lecture halls themselves were often ill-suited for comfortable learning. They were often cold and damp in winter, with no heating beyond perhaps a small brazier, and stuffy and unventilated in summer. The lighting would be dim, relying on natural light from windows or, after dusk, the flickering, smoky illumination of oil lamps. These physical discomforts contributed significantly to your inability to focus and made the already monotonous lectures even more arduous to endure. So, your daily life as a medieval university student was dominated by the dull, repetitive reality of monotonous lectures and endless rote learning. Your pursuit of knowledge was a passive, often physically uncomfortable, and profoundly uninspiring grind, relying heavily on your ability to memorize vast amounts of Latin text. This pervasive boredom, coupled with the rigid, authority-driven pedagogical methods, made your time at a medieval university undeniably awful and boring, even as you sat through hours of monotonous lectures. Your greatest academic challenge, and a significant source of misery, stemmed from the severe scarcity of books. Forget bustling libraries filled with thousands of volumes. In a medieval university, books were incredibly rare, precious, and laboriously produced, forcing you to rely almost entirely on your own memory, making your studies profoundly awful and boring. Imagine a lecture hall. Your professor has the single, authoritative copy of the text. You and hundreds of other students have no personal copies. Books were hand-copied, painstakingly transcribed by scribes, often monks, in a process that could take months or even years for a single volume. This made them astronomically expensive. Far beyond the reach of an ordinary student, a single textbook could cost more than a peasant's annual income, sometimes even more than a small house. It truly sucked to be in college without textbooks. This extreme scarcity meant that memory was your most crucial tool. You were expected to listen intently to your professor's lecturi reading, commit vast passages of Latin text to memory, and synthesize complex arguments in your mind. Imagine trying to internalize entire philosophical treatises, theological debates, or legal codes simply by listening and perhaps taking sparse notes on a wax tablet. Your intellectual success hinged entirely on your capacity for rote memorization, a relentless mental exercise that left little room for genuine understanding or critical reflection. Your notes, if you could afford the parchment, were fragmented and incomplete. You might scribble down key phrases, arguments, or the professor's interpretations, but these were crude summaries, not comprehensive texts. Later, you might try to piece together your notes with those of your classmates, painstakingly compiling a rough version of the lecture. But this was a cumbersome and imperfect process. The very act of studying outside of lectures was a challenge, as there were no readily available reference materials. The lack of personal copies also meant that independent study was severely limited. You couldn't easily review a complex argument at your leisure, revisit a difficult passage, or delve deeper into a topic on your own. Your access to knowledge was mediated almost entirely by your professor's lectures. This passive learning environment, driven by scarcity, constrained your intellectual curiosity and forced you into a rigid, dictated form of study. Sometimes, if you were lucky, or if you had a wealthy patron, you might gain access to a stationer's shop. These weren't bookstores. They were workshops where official, approved texts known as exemplars were held. You could rent individual pasia sections or quires of a book, copy them by hand yourself, and then return them. This was incredibly labor-intensive, time-consuming, and still expensive. Imagine spending your precious free time meticulously copying out a chapter of a book, and just to have your own incomplete version of a textbook. It really sucked to literally write your own homework. The quality of these hand-copied texts could also be problematic. Scribes, being human, made errors. You might be memorizing a text that contained transcription mistakes, or your own frantic notes might introduce inaccuracies. This created a constant layer of potential misinformation, making the pursuit of precise knowledge even more frustrating. One common misconception is that medieval universities had vast, organized libraries for students to access, while some monastic and cathedral libraries existed, and universities slowly began to accumulate collections. These were typically small, highly valuable, and often reserved for masters and senior scholars, not readily accessible to undergraduates. The concept of an OpenStack library for student use is a modern invention. Historians still meticulously study surviving medieval book lists and library catalogs to reconstruct the limited access students had to texts, confirming the profound scarcity of written materials. Furthermore, the very act of debate and disputation, while supposedly intellectual, was also limited by the scarcity of texts. You were arguing based on memorized passages and interpretations, not necessarily on broad, independent research. The debates often became exercises in rhetorical skill and memorized authority, rather than genuine intellectual exploration and the clash of original ideas. This made the intellectual pursuit itself feel rigid and constrained. The ultimate goal was to impress your professor with your mastery of the memorized material, not to contribute original thought. Originality was often seen as heresy or a challenge to established authority. Rather than a virtue, your academic success depended on your ability to replicate, not to innovate. This further contributed to the monotonous and uninspiring nature of your studies. So, your life as a student in a medieval university was profoundly awful and boring due to the severe scarcity of books. You were forced to rely almost entirely on your own memory, painstakingly absorbing vast amounts of information from spoken lectures, with little opportunity for independent study or critical engagement. This pervasive lack of accessible texts defined your academic experience, turning the pursuit of knowledge into a grueling, passive, and often frustrating exercise in rote memorization, even as your mind was stretched by monotonous lectures and your memory strained by the scarcity of books. Your physical existence as a medieval university student was defined by the horrible living conditions. Forget modern dorm rooms with climate control and private bathrooms. Your daily reality was one of cramped, unsanitary, and perpetually uncomfortable housing, making your pursuit of knowledge undeniably awful and boring. Imagine your dormitory. It wouldn't be a dedicated, purpose-built college hall in your early student years. Instead, you might find yourself sharing a rented room in a private house in the city or a communal dwelling within a less formal academic residence. These spaces were often small, dimly lit, and poorly ventilated. You'd be crammed together with several other students, sometimes sharing a single bed, or, more commonly, sleeping on straw mattresses laid out on the floor. Privacy was a non-existent luxury. Every aspect of your life, from studying to sleeping, was conducted in the constant presence of your peers. It truly sucked to live in a human sardine can. Hygiene was a significant challenge. Access to clean water for washing was limited, often requiring trips to a communal well or river. Personal bathing was infrequent, making body odor a pervasive reality. Latrines, if they existed, were rudimentary, often just cesspits or holes in the ground. Located far from living quarters and rarely cleaned, waste would accumulate, attracting flies and vermin, creating a constant, offensive stench that permeated your living space. Imagine trying to concentrate on Aristotle when the air around you is thick with the smell of human waste and unwashed bodies. The cold was a constant tormentor during the long winter months. Medieval buildings were notoriously drafty and difficult to heat. Your dormitory would likely have no fireplace, or perhaps only a small, shared brazier that offered minimal warmth. You would sleep in your clothes, huddled under thin blankets, your teeth chattering, your breath clouding in the freezing air. Studying would be agonizing, your fingers numb with cold, making it almost impossible to hold a quill or turn the pages of a borrowed text. Frostbite was a real concern, and respiratory illnesses like pneumonia, exacerbated by cold and damp conditions, would sweep through the crowded dormitories, often proving fatal. It really sucked to literally freeze while studying, while in summer, the conditions would swing to the opposite extreme. The unventilated rooms would become stiflingly hot and stuffy, trapping the heat and the unpleasant odors. The crowded conditions would breed fleas, lice, and bedbugs, ensuring constant itching and disrupted sleep. The very air would feel thick and oppressive, making deep, restorative rest an elusive dream, contributing to your perpetual exhaustion. Food preparation and consumption in these cramped quarters also added to the squalor. While meals might be taken in a communal dining hall, if your college had one, many students would eat simple, cold fare in their rooms. Leftover food scraps could attract mice and rats, which were common occupants of medieval dwellings, further contributing to unsanitary conditions and the spread of disease. You might wake up to the unsettling sound of rodents scurrying across your floor. It truly sucked to share your room with vermin. One common misconception is that medieval universities were pristine, scholarly enclaves. In reality, medieval cities, including university towns, were often quite unsanitary, and student housing reflected these broader conditions. Early university colleges sometimes began as simple hospices or rented rooms, with little regard for modern concepts of comfort or hygiene. The ideal of intellectual pursuit often coexisted with a very harsh physical reality. Historians still meticulously study archaeological excavations of medieval urban dwellings and college sites, finding evidence of primitive sanitation, widespread pest infestations, and cramped living spaces, confirming the dire conditions described in contemporary accounts. Furthermore, the lack of privacy in such cramped conditions would have a profound psychological impact. You had no personal space to retreat to, no quiet corner for introspection or emotional solitude. Every aspect of your life was open to your peers, fostering a constant awareness of observation and making genuine personal reflection difficult. This communal, yet often isolating, existence could breed tension, resentment, and a profound sense of never truly being alone. The constant exposure to unsanitary conditions and the rapid spread of disease meant that illness was a frequent companion. A single sick student could quickly infect an entire room, leading to outbreaks of various fevers, dysentery, or other ailments for which medieval medicine had little effective cure. Your pursuit of knowledge was perpetually interrupted by bouts of sickness, further hindering your already arduous studies. So, your daily life as a student in a medieval university was profoundly awful and boring, not just for its intellectual demands, but for its utterly miserable living conditions. You endured cramped, unsanitary, and perpetually uncomfortable housing, battling cold, heat, and rampant disease. This pervasive squalor and the constant physical discomfort were a defining, terrible aspect of your academic journey, ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge often came at the steep cost of your personal comfort and well-being, even as your body shivered in cramped dorms and your mind strained under endless lectures. Your physical endurance as a medieval university student was constantly tested by another fundamental misery: awful food. Forget diverse dining options or even consistently palatable meals. Your daily diet was a monotonous, meager, and often unappetizing affair, making your pursuit of knowledge undeniably awful and boring. Imagine mealtime in your college or student lodging. It wasn't a pleasant social event for most medieval students, especially those not from the wealthiest noble families. Meals were rudimentary and designed for bare sustenance, not enjoyment. Your main staples would be bread and ale, consumed with almost every meal. The bread would be coarse, dark, and often made from cheaper grains like rye or barley, baked into dense, hard loaves. It wouldn't be fresh or fluffy. It would be designed to fill your stomach and provide basic calories, often serving as a trencher, an edible plate for other food. It truly sucked to chew on bread that felt like a brick. Pottage or gruel would be your frequent companion, especially for breakfast and dinner. This was a thick, often bland porridge or stew made from boiled grains oats, barley, peas, or beans, cooked with water and perhaps a few meager vegetables if available. Meat was a rare luxury, usually reserved for feast days or for wealthier students. Imagine a watery, unseasoned mush. Consumed day after day, week after week, the sheer monotony of the taste and texture would be soul-crushing, turning the act of eating into a joyless chore. Meat was indeed a rarity for the average student. While not forbidden year-round like for monks in some orders, it was expensive and not a daily staple. When it did appear, it might be tough, salted, or dried meat, often boiled into stews rather than roasted or fried. Due to fuel and cooking equipment limitations, fish might provide some protein, especially during the numerous fasting days dictated by the church, but it too would often be dried or salted, making it less palatable than fresh catches. Vegetables were seasonal and limited to hardy crops like cabbages, onions, leeks, and root vegetables. Fresh fruits were even rarer, largely consumed only when in season, or preserved as dried fruits like figs or dates, which were more expensive. This meant that your diet often lacked essential vitamins and minerals. Contributing to chronic nutritional deficiencies, you might suffer from scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, anemia, iron deficiency, or various other ailments stemming from a lack of diverse nutrients, leaving you constantly fatigued and vulnerable to illness. It really sucked when your food made you sick. The quality of the food itself could also be questionable. Without modern refrigeration or food safety standards, spoilage was common. Grains could be infested with weevils, bread could become moldy, and stored provisions could rot. You might unknowingly consume contaminated food, leading to severe gastrointestinal distress, dysentery, or other foodborne illnesses, further hindering your studies and putting your life at risk. Imagine taking a bite of food, unsure if it would nourish you or make you violently ill. Your meals were often eaten communally, in a college hall or shared lodging. While this fostered some camaraderie, the focus was on efficiency and basic sustenance, not leisurely dining. Students often had to buy their own provisions or contribute to a shared pot, and corruption or mismanagement of funds by college masters could further reduce the quality and quantity of your food. One common misconception is that medieval students, being intellectual, somehow ate better than common laborers, while they weren't suffering from acute starvation like some peasants during famine. Their diet was designed for austerity and control. It was far from balanced or appetizing by modern standards. The purpose was to keep them alive and focused on studies, not to provide culinary delight or optimal nutrition. Historians still meticulously study medieval college accounts and dietary regulations, comparing them with archaeological evidence from student living quarters like food remnants in waste pits, to reconstruct the specifics of their daily meals, often revealing a consistent pattern of blandness and limited variety. Furthermore, The act of eating itself might be done in haste. Between lectures or before arduous study sessions, there was no time for leisurely breaks or elaborate preparations. Your meals were simply fuel, consumed quickly to get back to the demanding academic schedule. This utilitarian approach stripped eating of its social and psychological comforts, reducing it to a mechanical necessity. So, your daily life as a student in a medieval university was profoundly awful and boring due to the miserable reality of your diet. You endured monotonous meals of coarse bread, bland pottage, and scarce protein, perpetually battling hunger and nutritional deficiencies. This relentless, unappetizing fare was a constant reminder of your austere existence, ensuring that even the fundamental act of eating was a source of profound discomfort and dissatisfaction in your relentless pursuit of knowledge, even as your body struggled with the miserable food and your mind battled monotonous lectures. Your life as a medieval university student was rigidly controlled by a pervasive and brutal system of discipline and punishment. Forget academic freedom or gentle guidance. Your education was often enforced by the very real threat of physical pain, making your pursuit of knowledge undeniably awful and boring. Imagine the constant tension that permeated your daily life. Your master's professors and college officials held immense authority over you. They weren't just educators, they were moral guardians and disciplinarians, responsible for instilling not only knowledge, but also piety, obedience, and conformity to the strict rules of the university and the church. Every aspect of your behavior, from your attendance at lectures to your conduct in the streets, was scrutinized. It truly sucked to have your every move watched. Physical punishment was a commonplace and expected part of medieval student life. This wasn't reserved for severe crimes. Even minor infractions could earn you a beating. Imagine being caught speaking in your native tongue instead of Latin, arriving late to a lecture, engaging in a noisy distraction, or even having sloppy handwriting in your notes. These seemingly minor transgressions could result in swift and painful retribution. Your masters believed that learning was best instilled through fear and pain, echoing the medieval proverb, "A boy's ear is on his back. He listens when he is beaten." The tools of discipline were simple but effective. The ferula, a cane or stick, a strap, or even a teacher's bare hand. Beatings might target your knuckles, your back, or your buttocks. Imagine the sting, the raw pain, and the public humiliation of being caned in front of your peers. This constant threat of physical violence would hang over you, turning every academic endeavor, every moment of your day, into a source of anxiety. You learn to suppress any urge for mischief or rebellion, not out of respect, but out of a primal desire to avoid pain. It really sucked to literally be beaten for a bad grade. For more serious offenses, such as truancy skipping classes, engaging in excessive drunkenness, participating in street brawls, a common occurrence, as we'll discuss, or challenging a master's authority. The punishments would escalate. You might face public flogging within the college courtyard, or even a more severe beating with a heavy stick, potentially leading to lasting injuries or public disgrace. These were designed not just to punish, but to make a terrifying example of you, reinforcing the absolute power of the university authorities. Beyond physical pain, there was the constant threat of fines, public humiliation, and expulsion. If your parents were paying your fees, a fine might be levied, adding to their financial burden. Public humiliation could involve being forced to wear a cap signifying your transgression, or being paraded through the college. Expulsion was the ultimate academic death sentence, meaning your parents' investment was wasted, and your future career path irrevocably closed, forcing you back to a less desirable life. The concept of student rights simply didn't exist. You were considered a minor, regardless of your physical age, subject to the authority of your masters and the university statutes. There was no appeal process for unfair punishments, no outside body to intervene on your behalf. Your life was completely at the mercy of the university's internal justice system, which often prioritized strict discipline over individual welfare. One common misconception is that medieval university students were docile and always obeyed rules. In reality, student life was often tumultuous, with frequent clashes between students and townsfolk, and even between students from different nations within the university, as mentioned in Chapter 1. The very brutality of the discipline suggests that defiance was common, and authorities had to resort to severe measures to maintain order. Historians still meticulously study medieval university statutes and court records, which detail an astonishing array of student misbehavior, from petty theft to violent assaults, revealing a rowdy and often rebellious student population despite the harsh punishments. Furthermore, the pervasive influence of the church on university life meant that moral transgressions were also severely punished. Blasphemy, heresy even inadvertently expressed in a philosophical debate, or perceived immoral conduct could lead to ecclesiastical penalties, which might include excommunication or even being handed over to secular authorities for more severe punishment. This religious dimension added another layer of anxiety to your academic life, forcing you to constantly censor your thoughts and actions. So, your daily life as a student in a medieval university was not just about intellectual rigor. It was a perpetual negotiation with authority, constantly overshadowed by the very real threat of physical pain. This pervasive system of discipline and punishment, enforced by the master's whip and the constant fear of reprisal, ensured that your pursuit of knowledge was profoundly awful and boring, forcing you into absolute obedience at the cost of your personal freedom and comfort, even as your body suffered the relentless physical discipline and your mind battled monotonous lectures. Your pursuit of knowledge in a medieval university was constantly hampered by a pervasive, isolating barrier, the language itself. Forget learning in your native tongue. You were immersed entirely in Latin, a complex and demanding language that few truly mastered, making your academic life profoundly awful and boring. Imagine your daily reality. You arrive at university, perhaps from a village where only your local dialect was spoken, or from a region where French, German, or English was your everyday language. Suddenly, every single lecture, every academic discussion, every student interaction, every prayer, and even much of your informal conversation is conducted exclusively in Latin. This wasn't just another subject to learn, it was the very medium of your entire existence within the university. It truly sucked to live in a foreign language. Your initial weeks and months would be a relentless struggle of comprehension. You'd sit in lectures, straining to understand the nuances of a complex philosophical argument presented in a language that felt foreign and abstract. You'd grasp at individual words, trying to piece together meaning, often missing the broader context. Imagine trying to learn advanced mathematics or theology when the very words being used are a constant source of mental exertion. This language barrier significantly slowed your learning, turning every lesson into an uphill battle. Even outside the lecture hall, Latin permeated every aspect of your life. Conversations with your fellow students, debates in the communal hall, discussions with your masters, all were expected to be in Latin. If you were caught speaking in your vernacular tongue, you could face punishment, from fines to physical discipline. This constant pressure to speak a foreign language, even when exhausted or frustrated, added another layer of mental strain to your already demanding schedule. It really sucked to be punished for speaking your own language, The difficulty was compounded by the fact that medieval Latin was not the simplified, easily digestible form you might encounter in some introductory courses today. It was often a complex, highly formal, and technical language, full of specific theological, philosophical, and legal terminology. Understanding these subtle distinctions required immense dedication and immersion, making genuine mastery a lifelong pursuit. Your ability to engage in debates and disputations, a core part of the university curriculum, was entirely dependent on your Latin fluency. These were public arguments where you had to articulate complex ideas, formulate logical rebuttals, and defend your positions. All spontaneously in Latin. Imagine the terror of facing a sharp-witted opponent in a public debate, knowing that a grammatical error or a misplaced word could undermine your entire argument and expose you to ridicule. This pressure to perform flawlessly in a foreign language was immense. One common misconception is that all medieval people spoke Latin fluently, while Latin was the language of the church and academia. Most common people did not speak it, even among the educated. Fluency varied widely. The requirement for university students to operate entirely in Latin was a deliberate pedagogical choice, designed to create a universal scholarly community across Europe and to ensure access to authoritative texts. But it was a significant barrier for students from diverse linguistic backgrounds. Historians still meticulously study medieval Latin grammars and student textbooks to understand the precise methods used to teach and enforce Latin usage within universities, revealing the challenges faced by students. Furthermore, the lack of readily available Latin to vernacular dictionaries or translation tools made independent learning incredibly challenging. You couldn't simply look up a word you didn't understand. You had to infer meaning from context, ask a more senior student or a master, or simply struggle through. This reliance on limited resources made the linguistic barrier even more formidable, further isolating you intellectually. This linguistic isolation also meant that your intellectual world was largely confined to the established body of Latin texts and the Latin-speaking scholarly community. While this fostered a sense of universal academia, it also limited your exposure to ideas and innovations expressed in other languages, or to the rich vernacular literature developing outside the university walls. Your intellectual horizons, while vast within the Latin sphere, were simultaneously constrained by its boundaries. So, your daily life as a student in a medieval university was profoundly awful and boring due to the pervasive and inescapable language barrier of Latin. Every lecture, every conversation, every moment of study was an arduous struggle to comprehend and express yourself in a foreign tongue. This constant linguistic challenge, coupled with the rigid enforcement of Latin usage, made your pursuit of knowledge a mentally exhausting and often isolating ordeal, ensuring that the acquisition of wisdom came at the cost of continuous linguistic strain. Even as your mind struggled with the intricacies of Latin and your body endured cramped living conditions, your life as a medieval university student was far from a monastic pursuit of knowledge. Beyond the lecture halls and dormitories, a vibrant, often dangerous, and undeniably awful student life existed, characterized by riots, drunkenness, and constant danger that frequently spilled into the streets of your university town. Imagine life outside the classroom. You were a young man, often far from home, with limited supervision and a newfound sense of independence, however superficial. This volatile mix often led to a culture of boisterous revelry and aggressive behavior. Alcohol, primarily ale or wine, flowed freely in the numerous taverns that sprang up around university districts. Students, freed from the strictures of their villages, often indulged excessively, leading to widespread drunkenness, public disorder, and a significant amount of the fun that often made student life memorable. For better or worse, it truly sucked to wake up with a medieval hangover. However, this boisterousness often escalated into full-blown street brawls and riots. The medieval university town was a powder keg of tension between the students and the local townsfolk, or burghers. Townsfolk often resented the students' privileges, such as exemption from local taxes and laws, as students were under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Their often rowdy behavior, their perceived arrogance, and their tendency to drive up prices for lodging and food, students, in turn, often looked down upon the townsfolk, viewing them as uneducated and uncouth. This simmering resentment frequently erupted into violent clashes. Imagine walking down a narrow, crowded street, perhaps after a night of drinking. When an argument breaks out with a local merchant or a group of artisans, words would quickly escalate into blows, and soon, a full-scale riot could erupt. Students, often armed with daggers, sticks, or even rocks, would clash with angry townsfolk, leading to injuries, property damage, and sometimes even deaths. These town and gown riots were a recurring feature of medieval university life. Adding a constant element of danger to your daily existence, it really sucked to literally fight for your right to party. Your involvement in these brawls was not always voluntary. Loyalty to your nation, the regional group students belonged to, or your college often meant you were expected to join in the fray. Defending your peers against rival groups of students or hostile townsfolk, this fostered a sense of camaraderie, but also dragged you into potentially deadly confrontations. You might return to your dormitory bruised, battered, or even seriously wounded, risking academic punishment or legal repercussions if secular authorities intervened. Beyond physical violence, student life could also involve less direct, but still problematic, forms of misbehavior. Prostitution was common in university towns, leading to moral temptations and potentially the spread of venereal diseases, for which medieval medicine had no effective cure. Gambling and petty theft were also prevalent. Fueled by limited funds and a desire for entertainment, these illicit activities further contributed to the chaotic and often morally ambiguous atmosphere of student life. One common historical misconception is that medieval students were primarily focused on religious piety and serious study. While a strong religious framework existed, student life was often far more turbulent and rebellious than popular imagination suggests. Medieval university records, which meticulously document student transgressions and disciplinary actions, reveal a remarkably high incidence of drunkenness, fighting, and petty crime, suggesting a constant struggle for authorities to maintain order among the unruly student population. Historians still meticulously study these disciplinary records and judicial proceedings to understand the true social dynamics and cultural norms of medieval student communities, often finding them to be surprisingly similar to some aspects of modern student life, albeit with much harsher consequences. Furthermore, the very concept of academic freedom, while lauded in theory by some scholars, was often put to the test by unruly student behavior. Repeated riots or challenges to local authority could lead to severe crackdowns from town councils, or even the temporary dissolution of the university or the exodus of masters and students to another city. This constant tension between student autonomy and civic order was a defining feature of the medieval university landscape. The lack of effective policing and urban infrastructure also meant that the dangers of student life were amplified. Dark, narrow streets, rudimentary sanitation, and the absence of rapid medical response meant that even minor altercations could escalate quickly into life-threatening situations. You were living in a rough and tumble environment where personal safety was often your own responsibility, and help was rarely swift. So, your life as a student in a medieval university far from being a tranquil scholarly pursuit, was perpetually punctuated by the chaotic reality of riots, drunkenness, and constant danger. This less glamorous, often violent, side of student life added another profound layer to the miseries of your existence, ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge often involved risking your body and your reputation in the grimy, unpredictable streets of a medieval university town, making it undeniably awful and boring, even if you, the medieval university student, managed to survive the grueling lectures, the horrible living conditions, and the street brawls. A different kind of disappointment would likely await you upon graduation-limited job prospects and a frustratingly narrow career path. Forget a wide array of high-paying opportunities. Your hard-earned knowledge often funneled you into a few specific roles, making the ultimate outcome of your years of study undeniably awful and boring. Imagine enduring years of intense study, mastering Latin, memorizing countless texts, and surviving the harsh discipline. You finally receive your Master of Arts degree after roughly 6-7 years of study, or perhaps even a doctorate in a higher faculty like theology, law, or medicine, which could take another 5 to 10 years. You might envision a life of influence, intellectual prestige, and comfortable living. But the reality was often far more constrained. It truly sucked to realize your degree was just a fancy piece of parchment. The most common and often best-paying career path for a medieval university graduate was in the church. This meant becoming a priest, a monk, or an administrator within the vast ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Your literacy and knowledge of Latin made you invaluable to the church, which was the largest employer of educated men. You might serve as a parish priest, a canon in a cathedral, a scholar in a monastery, or rise through the ranks to become an abbot or a bishop. While these positions offered security and status, they also demanded strict adherence to religious doctrine, a life of celibacy for priests, and often a profound lack of personal freedom. Your intellectual pursuits would now be primarily dedicated to theological interpretation and this perpetuation of church dogma, leaving little room for independent thought or secular innovation. Another major avenue was the legal profession. If you studied canon law, church law, or civil law, Roman law, you could become a lawyer, a judge, or an administrator in secular courts or royal chanceries. This field offered considerable influence and financial reward, as legal expertise was crucial for managing feudal lands, resolving disputes, and administering justice for kings and nobles. However, this path also involved navigating complex political landscapes and serving powerful, often capricious, patrons. Your intellectual rigor would be applied to dusty legal texts and often morally ambiguous cases. Far from the philosophical ideals you might have once debated, medicine was a specialized, but often precarious, field. If you studied at a renowned medical school like Salerno or Montpellier, you might become a physician, serving noble households or wealthy urban patrons. This could be a lucrative path, offering high status. However, medieval medicine was still rudimentary, often ineffective, and fraught with dangers, as we discussed in earlier episodes about medical cures. Your practice would involve bloodletting, herbal remedies, and rudimentary surgery, often with limited success, and you would constantly face the risk of losing patients to diseases you couldn't cure, sometimes leading to accusations of incompetence. It really sucked to be a doctor who couldn't really cure anything. For the vast majority of graduates, especially those from the Faculty of Arts who didn't pursue higher degrees, the prospects were even more limited. You might become a school teacher in a grammar school, perpetuating the same rigorous, Latin-focused education you had endured. This was a respectable, but often poorly paid, profession. a life of endless repetition. You might also become a scribe for a lord or a merchant, meticulously copying documents or managing accounts. A tedious existence much like that described in the ancient Egyptian context, albeit with different materials. The idea of a research scientist, an engineer, a novelist, or a corporate executive simply didn't exist. Innovation was slow, technologies rudimentary, and the social structures rigid. Your academic knowledge was primarily valued for its application within the existing hierarchical frameworks of the church, law, or royal administration. There was little room for true entrepreneurship or a self-made career based purely on your intellectual prowess outside of these established systems. One common misconception is that all medieval university graduates automatically found high-status positions, while a university degree certainly provided an advantage, especially compared to the illiterate masses. Competition for truly lucrative or influential roles was fierce. Many graduates from humbler backgrounds struggled to find stable employment and sometimes returned to their villages. Their years of study, a heavy financial burden with little practical return. Historians still meticulously study medieval career paths and patronage networks to understand the varying success rates of university graduates, often finding that connections and family status played as crucial a role as academic achievement. Furthermore, the very nature of these established careers meant a continuation of the rigid discipline and lack of freedom you experienced as a student. Whether a priest, a lawyer, or a royal administrator, your life would be dictated by institutional rules, hierarchical structures, and the demands of powerful patrons. The intellectual freedom you might have glimpsed in philosophical debates was often constrained by the practicalities of earning a living within a tightly controlled society. So, your life after a medieval university, far from being a boundless vista of opportunity, was often a frustratingly narrow channel. Your hard-earned knowledge funneled you into a few specific professions, primarily serving the church or the state, often perpetuating the same rigid hierarchy and lack of personal autonomy you endured as a student. This limited outlook, combined with the often monotonous realities of these careers, made the ultimate outcome of your medieval university education undeniably awful and boring. You've endured the early start to your academic journey, suffered through monotonous lectures, struggled with the scarcity of books, shivered in squalid dormitories, choked down awful food, felt the sting of the master's whip, battled the omnipresent Latin, and even survived the street brawls, only to face limited career prospects. As the distant echoes of Latin chants fade and the phantom chill of your unheated room dissipates, a profound, lingering truth settles upon you. Your life as a student in a medieval university was ultimately a gilded cage, where the pursuit of knowledge came at the cost of immense personal freedom, comfort, and sometimes even your very soul. It was a life that was undeniably awful and boring. Consider the paradox of your pursuit. You sought knowledge, the highest intellectual pursuit in medieval society, believing it would elevate you, provide understanding, and open doors to a better life. And in many ways, it did. You gained illiteracy, a rare and powerful skill. You engaged with the great thinkers of antiquity, absorbed complex theological and philosophical arguments, and honed your logical and rhetorical abilities. This intellectual awakening was a profound personal transformation, setting you apart from the illiterate masses. You were indeed privileged to be able to even attempt this journey. However, this intellectual freedom came wrapped in layers of profound personal constraint and discomfort. From the tender age of 14 or 15, you were ripped from your family and thrust into a highly regimented, often brutal. Environment, your body endured constant physical discomfort, cramped living spaces, hard beds, pervasive cold, and inadequate sanitation. Your palate suffered the monotony of bland, unappetizing food, leaving you perpetually on the brink of hunger. These were not minor inconveniences. They were fundamental miseries that pervaded your daily existence, making the pursuit of knowledge a physical endurance test. Your intellectual journey itself was often stifled by the rigid pedagogical methods. Lectures were passive, focused on rote memorization and the absorption of authoritative texts, with little room for critical inquiry or independent thought, especially in your foundational years. The scarcity of books meant that your knowledge was largely dictated by what your master chose to read aloud. You were trained to become a repository of established wisdom, not a generator of new ideas that might challenge accepted dogma. This intellectual confinement, in a place supposedly dedicated to learning, often made your studies profoundly boring. It truly sucked to have your brilliance confined. Then there was the pervasive discipline and fear. The master's whip was a constant threat, ensuring conformity and obedience, errors, tardiness, or minor infractions were met with painful physical punishment. Beyond the classroom, your life was monitored with strict rules governing your conduct. Your language always Latin, and your social interactions. You were constantly aware that your privileged position was conditional, dependent on your absolute submission to authority. This environment of fear robbed you of spontaneity and genuine personal expression, leaving you in a perpetual state of vigilance. Even your social life, while offering camaraderie, was fraught with its own dangers. The nations and colleges, while providing a sense of belonging, also fueled fierce rivalries that often escalated into violent street brawls with other students or resentful townsfolk. Your pursuit of knowledge sometimes meant risking your physical safety, transforming the academic environment into a surprisingly perilous urban landscape. And finally, the limited prospects and lack of true autonomy upon graduation. Your years of grueling study often funneled you into a few predetermined career paths, primarily serving the church or the state. While these offered security and status, they often meant a continuation of the rigid hierarchy, institutional control, and lack of personal freedom you experienced as a student. Your intellect was a valuable asset, but it was rarely truly yours to direct or unleash in a completely independent manner. The knowledge you gained was expensive, bought at the cost of a truly free life. One particularly poignant and often overlooked detail about medieval university life is the concept of perpetual students who spent many years, even decades, in university without necessarily earning a higher degree. Some individuals, drawn by the intellectual atmosphere or escaping the harshness of peasant life, would remain in university for an extraordinarily long time, moving between lectures, engaging in debates, and perhaps living a relatively unburdened existence compared to their rural counterparts. However, this often meant they never achieved a formal career or true economic independence, highlighting a different kind of cost to perpetual scholarship. Historians still debate the precise social and economic circumstances of these career students, and whether their prolonged presence contributed to university stability or further complicated student-town relations. Ultimately, your life as a medieval university student was a profound paradox. You embarked on a noble quest for knowledge, entering a world that shimmered with intellectual prestige. Yet, this world was a gilded cage, beautiful in its promise, but brutal in its reality. You gained wisdom, but lost comfort, You acquired status, but sacrificed freedom. You experienced intellectual growth, but endured relentless boredom and soul-crushing discipline. The pursuit of knowledge was a costly endeavor, extracting a profound human toll, ensuring that your medieval academic life was undeniably awful and boring. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant murmurs of Latin lectures and the phantom chill of medieval dormitories fade into the quiet background of history. You are safe, warm, and free, incredibly far removed from the brutal realities of ancient academia. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the boundless possibilities that come with true intellectual freedom, physical comfort, and the ability to choose your own path. A stark contrast to the awful and boring truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night and have sweet dream.